At this point in gaming history, is there really anything left to be said about Final Fantasy VI? It has already been labeled as one of the greatest RPGs ever made. It is in the top of many top 10 best Super Nintendo games lists. The soundtrack is recognized as one of the greatest ever made. So really, what is left to be said? In all actuality, nothing, unless you are a fanboy like me who doesn't care if he is covering already known information about a widely accepted game. As everyone should know by now, Final Fantasy VI was released as Final Fantasy III in the US, and I have already covered the reasoning behind this choice during my look back at Final Fantasy IV, so I will leave this well-known fact at that and move towards more interesting stuff, such as the history behind the game itself! It is very common knowledge that the first 5 main games in the series were headed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, but this time he decided to hand the reins over to 2 new directors, Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito, who were tasked to breathe new life into the Final Fantasy series. Within a time span of only 1 year, these men accomplished the task given to them, and Final Fantasy VI was released on the Famicom on April 4th of 1994. Now the question might be in your mind on whether Sakaguchi was actually proud of his team or not, and in response, allow me to quote Nobuo Uematsu himself. "I still remember when, during the launch party for Final Fantasy VI, the notoriously unforgiving Mr. Sakaguchi gave a speech. Thanks to every one of you, we have created the best game in the world. No! The universe! Thank you!" I cried. There were tears on my face. Those tears made me realize just how much I had invested myself in the project. I hope that the Final Fantasy games forever continue to be a source of joy, not only for the fans, but for the developers as well. Nobuo Uematsu, liner notes of Final Fantasy XIV Battle Tracks. The reason Sakaguchi and the team at Squaresoft were so pleased is because they had a vision, a dream if you will, that they would release a game that would not only shape the Final Fantasy series but the RPG genre itself. And if the reviews, reception, and lasting effects the game had is anything to go by, they surpassed this dream by about 1,000,000 miles. Even though there were a few time crunches at the end of development, it went by quite smoothly. Then there was localization. Let me set the stage for you. Imagine you are sitting at your desk and your name might just be Ted Woolsey, and you are handed a script, a game cartridge, and told that you have 1 month to translate it due to the desired release time. To make a long story short, after 2 rewrites, which included all of the Nintendo of America required censorship, the localization was finally ready and released on October 20th of 1994. And to the surprise of everyone, this had fantastic reviews and feedback from the fans, becoming the first truly, for the lack of a better term, profitable release of a Final Fantasy game in the US, totaling to about 3.5 million total copies shipped and sold worldwide. Now, if you allow me, I will cover some of the changes that had to be made during the localization for the US market, even though this will be a rather short segment. First and foremost would be the religious imagery, even though quite a bit still got through, such as the change for the spell Holy to Pearl because the spell is white and looks like pearls, you get it? This, once again, was a normal thing at the time to see changed, since Nintendo of America was still rather scared of offending people and religion. There were also some changes related to cultural references that would have made no sense outside of Japan, but the most recognizable changes would be the censorship of nudity, if you will. Take the Esper Siren, for example, and her design. Here you can see the version of the initial release in the US. She is fully dressed and leaves much to the imagination, but if you were in Japan, you can totally see her butt. Oh my god, what the hell? Think of the children, Squaresoft! This is why I'm addicted to Scarlett Johansson now! Sure, there are more specific changes I could cover, but why? I mean, why would I spend the time on that since this will be long enough as it is? On that note, let's look at the story. Final Fantasy VI's story can easily be separated into 3 separate acts, even easier than the previous games in the series. I label these acts myself as follows. Act 1, The Returners, Act 2, The Fall, and Act 3, Rebirth. Act 1 takes place 1,000 years after the War of the Magi, and follows the war between the Gestalian Empire and the Returners. The Returners is a small force of rebels fighting against an emperor who is vying for control of everything, which should sound very familiar for a very, very good reason. The opening act story can easily be compared to Star Wars, though later in this series we will talk about an even better comparison. Act 2 takes place after the group is separated and meets back in Narsh. The story then follows the discovery of the Esper world and concludes by following the destruction of the world as it is known, ending with a conflict on a floating continent. Act 3 follows the story of our heroes as they traverse through the world of ruin and their attempt to defeat Kefka and bring peace back to the now devastated world. There is a significant flow of the events in this game that help the story grow and become recognized as one of the best in this series. The story alone, aside from the execution alone, has specific aspects that set it aside. The writers weren't afraid of touching on aspects of life and death, from watching parents die, leaving a child orphaned, to even watching a character attempt suicide after the closest thing she had to a father dies. Though there was a decision made during the initial development that added to the story in a way that we haven't seen before. The decision was made by Sakaguchi that there shouldn't be one main protagonist, a la Cecil from Final Fantasy IV. So out of the 14 playable characters, 11 of them have their own story arcs that reveals their backstories and more behind why they are fighting against the Gestaltian Empire. Though on that point, I did say 14 playable characters for a reason. Final Fantasy VI has the most playable characters to date, and there are even points where you will be required to separate the 14 characters into 3 different parties of 4 members, which meant that you were also required to spend time developing each character to be able to build balanced teams. Now, for the sake of completion, I will cover the main characters before moving forwards. There is Terra, the half-Esper, half-human, who is widely considered as the actual main protagonist despite the game's design. Locke, the master thief, treasure hunter. King Edgar, the master of tools like drills, chainsaws, and crossbows. Crossbows aren't really tools in the first place, Squaresoft. The monk and twin brother of Edgar, Sabin, who is a beast. Shadow, the ninja, who would kill his own mother for a nickel. The things Nintendo censorship let slide. Master swordsman Cyan, the retainer of Doma Castle. Gal, the feral wild child from the Veldt, who can imitate monsters he has fought by going berserk. Celeste, the Gestaltian general and Magitech knight, who is uber useful in battle once you get her. Realm, a young girl who likes to consider herself a great painter. Strago, the elderly blue mage and grandfather of Realm. Mog, the first and only playable Moogle in the main series of Final Fantasy, who is a master ballerina and also kawaii Desuneki. Umaru, a berserk yeti. Setzer, the famed gambling ladies man who is the only man in the world to possess an airship. Then finally, Gogo, the strangely dressed man or woman, no one knows, who fights by copying the actions of other members on their team, which can make him either really useful and broken or worthless depending on how you set up your teams. Good lord, that was a mouthful. And now I would like to take some time to look at a few of the things they changed with this entry to the series, along with the items that influenced the later games in the series or even became running gags. First and foremost, I should have mentioned the setting of the game itself. Up to this point, the Final Fantasy series was placed in a medieval time frame of knights and kingdoms. Final Fantasy VI, however, takes place in a steampunk-styled era that can be compared to the Industrial Revolution of our world. Magic has been forged into an energy supply for walking battle tanks and other mechanizations. This was the first step in the series that sets up the worlds for the games that came after it, showing a more technological worlds. This was also the game that introduced comical relief characters of Biggs and Wedge, who appeared at the beginning of the game along with Terra during the introduction scenes. These two characters will become symbolic to the Final Fantasy series, along with Cid for quite a long time, though their staying power was not quite as strong. The magic system was completely changed from previous games. Originally, you would either learn spells by leveling up or purchasing and finding spellbooks. Final Fantasy VI introduced a system that allowed you to equip magicite shards, which are refined espers that allowed you to learn different spells and added a level of customization for your entire party, which had not been seen previously. Now, you might think that this aspect can make things boring because at the end, all of the characters are the same. To that I say nay. Each character had their own special abilities that separated them from each other, such as Locke was the only character who had the ability to steal items, while Sabin had the ability to use monk skills that made magic mostly unneeded for him. The development team truly was intelligent enough to create a balance between the broken spell system and the character selection and choices. Though the biggest change to the series was the ability to completely control who is in your party at all times. Up to this point, including the games not released in the US, Square dictated who was in your party and allowed for no customization whatsoever. This is a particular aspect that continued through the remainder of the Final Fantasy series with a few limitations depending on the storyline for each particular game. As you can tell, the development and subsequent release of Final Fantasy VI was polarizing in regards to the series itself by changing up quite a lot, but there is still even more to cover. Gameplay was also thrown for a bit of a loop with the introduction of what I like to call battlegrounds and team dungeons. In these sections, you will separate your collection of characters between 2 or 3 different parties, and in battlegrounds, you will use your parties to fight swarms of enemies in an attempt to reach a commanding group and win. During the team dungeons, you will have to use your separated groups in conjunction with each other to progress through the dungeon by opening different paths and reach a goal point that normally will end with a difficult boss battle. There is also the introduction of side quests to the Final Fantasy series here. Take for example the hunt for the 8 dragons in the World of Ruin that will allow you to unlock the final Esper Crusader. Other side quests will involve finding specific characters in the World of Ruin, ultimate equipment, and character backstories. Both the party separation and side quests will be seen in the following games of the series. Now, very quickly, I would like to speak on the soundtrack, and I can promise you that this will be quick. Unlike Mystic Quest, Nobuo Uematsu took control of the score and really outdid himself. I gladly go on record stating that the soundtrack for Final Fantasy VI is one of the greatest soundtracks in gaming history and is easily in the top 3 for the Super Nintendo, and I am not alone in this opinion, to tell you the truth. If nothing else, you can see the effort placed into the score during an opera scene that takes place part of the way through Act 2. That is both touching and humorous as a comedy of errors, completely fleshed out with the best voice acting a 32-bit console had to offer at the time. There really isn't much left to say about the score of Final Fantasy VI other than if you haven't experienced it, find the songs now and listen to them. You're already on YouTube, so you can watch this video, and you can find them here. Stop this video. I don't care. Experiencing this piece of gaming history is more important than listening to me try to sound intelligent regarding video games, which I have to admit is a really nerdy and pathetic thing to do. Go! Why are you still here? Now that you have either unpaused this video or skipped ahead to this point because I know you went and listened to all the songs from the soundtrack, I would like to finish off with a few things. The first would be your options for playing this game. Of course, there is the original on the Super Nintendo and Super Famicom, but you can also play on the PlayStation with the release of Final Fantasy Anthology that came with Final Fantasy V as well, that had new FMV sequences and a few translation fixes. There is also a Game Boy Advance version which has an additional dungeon that ends with a new boss known as the Kaiser Dragon that will, to be frank, kick your ass hardcore. Now, the Kaiser Dragon was originally in the code for Final Fantasy VI. People have hacked in and found him, though if you are able to get to the fight for the Kaiser Dragon in the original release, you will notice that he has no script and he just constantly attacks, and there pretty much is no way to beat him whatsoever. The PlayStation version can be bought on the PlayStation Network, and the original can be attained on the Wii and Wii U Virtual Console. And finally, it has been announced that a version will be released later this year for iOS. So with this newfound information, there is no reason to not have played this entry to the series at this point. Now I would like to give my full opinion on the game. If you couldn't tell already, Final Fantasy VI is my personal favorite entry to the Final Fantasy series. This is due to the depth of the storyline, development of characters, gameplay, and of course the villain. Oh, what's that? I haven't talked about Kefka other than a passing comment, I hear you say? That is because I feel that he deserves a section of his own. Kefka, in my very own humble opinion, which means it's the only version of the truth that exists when it comes to Final Fantasy, is the greatest villain in the Final Fantasy history. Kefka is literally the Joker of the Final Fantasy series, and it isn't just due to his clown design and his mannerisms. This is also due to the fact that the only reason he does anything is to cause chaos. It isn't really a desire to rule, but to cause disorder and to make others suffer. that comparison aside, he is the only villain to ever truly reach his goal. He wanted to destroy the world and recreate it in his own image, and he does. Kefka is cruel in every definition of the word. In his introduction, you see him show his dominance by forcing soldiers to clean his boots before laughing, and oh dear God, that laugh will never leave your nightmares. This particular sound clip is etched into the mind even in death. He has the last laugh, and the fact that he is straight up psychotic and crazy. Hell, Kefka becomes God by the end of the game. Square depicted him as Jesus during the final battle with Mary. For more on that point, please refer to MatPat and his web series Game Theory. Now join me next time as we move away from the 2D sprites and into the world of the 3D modeling with Final Fantasy VII.